Hello, I think I've been talking to myself the last couple of minutes. Hopefully now you can hear me. So I'll start again. So basically, if you want to get straight to the talk on evergreen plants, I'll do a timestamp description below. So if you're watching on catch-up, you can go straight to the talk. But before that, we'll just discuss about the weather we've had this week and make sure I've got no more technical issues. Hopefully now we can hear me. Right, third attempt. Hopefully now we got some sound. So we're going to go and do a talk tonight, all being well, if the technology holds out, on hardy evergreen exotic plants for the garden. So we'll do that in a few minutes. Just make sure all the technical issues are ironed out. If you're watching this on catch up, there'll be a description in the description below. I'll do a little timestamp so you can go straight to the start of that presentation. But before we get into that, I'll just thought we'd mention the weather we've had this week. We've had 3 named storms. We're currently in Storm Franklin territory at the moment, so we've had really high wind speeds across the country, possibly the strongest winds we've had recorded in the Needles off the Isle of Wight. We've had 122 miles an hour on Friday, and we've had snow here at times. We've had heavy rains, wind. Thankfully no real damage in my garden, which is great. We sort of missed the really strong winds, unlike further down south and further north. We're sort of in the middle, and we sort of missed the worst of the weather. But currently we've got Storm Franklin, I think, starting now, and we've got local flooding in the area where the rivers are swelling. And I know a couple of train stations have been closed because of submerged lines and things like that. So the weather at the moment is not great for gardening or just being outside in general at the moment, because you're getting blown away. It can be dangerous if you've got lots of high trees or near scaffolding and things like that. It's not great to be out at the moment. So I think we've got sound. I think we've got all my technology set up, because I need a couple of screens for this to work tonight to do the presentation. So the aim is we'll go through the presentation first, and then if you've got any questions, we'll go to the chat afterwards. So let's start the presentation. So today we're going to talk about hardy evergreen exotic plants. So we're going to talk about plants that look good all year round in your garden. So that's where the hardy and the evergreen comes from. An exotic basically is a plant that looks non-native, looks amazing basically, either architecturally or the colour, the size, the scale of it. It just looks really impressive and out of place in a typical UK or sort of northern climate garden. So dual screen in here, so let's move the cursor about. So, like I said, an exotic plant is one that you wouldn't expect to find in a typical UK garden. So in the picture we've got here, we've got many plants that you wouldn't normally find in most UK gardens. So we've got things like the big banana plants, the gingers here, we've got the irisine, the nice dark leaf plants there, and in the background we've got some palm trees as well. So these are all exotic, but not all these are hardy and not all these are evergreen. So what we're looking at in this video specifically are those exotic plants that are evergreen, so they have green leaves or colourful leaves all year round throughout the winter as well as the summer. Hardy is very tenuous what hardy actually means. Basically a plant that looks good and survives all year round with minimal protection in the UK. So not talking about wrapping up plants, we're not talking about bringing them in, digging them up or anything like that. We're just talking about those plants that can withstand the British weather and survive and grow year after year. So that's what we mean by hardy plants. Obviously, depending on your location, hardy Plants can be not hardy in inland UK, but coastal UK they might be hardy. So there are variations of what we mean by hardy for some people depending on your location. But generally speaking, the plants I'm going to talk about in this presentation are hardy for 90% of the UK and a lot of Northern Europe and a lot of America as well. So depending where you're watching from, you might disagree with what I've chosen as hardy plants, but for my main audience these plants will be hardy, and we can discuss hardiness in the Q&A afterwards. So the first type of plants I want to talk about are bamboos, and bamboos can be really impressive as feature plants in the garden, and they can also be really good backdrops and a foil for other plants as well. So a lot of people can be scared of bamboos, thinking they're going to basically take over the garden, but with good management and choosing the right types of bamboo, you can have really nice hardy bamboos in your garden. Not all bamboos are hardy, but the ones you get on sale in the UK are nearly always very hardy, really hardy, down to -15, -20, even lower as well in some species. So there's two types really of bamboo. We have clumpers and we have runners. Ideally go for the clumping bamboos, because these are the bamboos which, yes, they will get bigger over time, but they will not randomly send out a shoot just under the soil surface and then appear several meters away in the middle of the lawn or in next door's garden. So runners can do this, clumpers don't do that. All bamboos basically fall into those two categories, clumpers and runners. To complicate things a little bit, a lot of runners behave like clumping bamboos for many years, and then after several years it'll send out runners because it's been drought and they've gone off search for water, or they've escaped and they've decided to mature a little bit further and send out runners to get bigger over time, to look for nutrients. So don't get confused by some bamboos which are said to be clumpers but are really runners. So the ones you're looking for true clumpers are the fargesias and the borindas. Fargesias are ones that grow sort of 1 meter, 2, maybe 3 meters tall, and they sort of slowly spread out in a controlled way. So you'll have one shoot coming up and then you'll have 10 shoots coming up, but they'll be very close to the original one shoot, and they'll just slowly spread out rather than randomly sending out shoots along the way away. So fargesias are small to medium sized clumping bamboos. Borindas are much bigger on the whole, very sort of similar to fargesias, but you can have the really brightly coloured blue culms on the borindas, and they can grow much taller, maybe sort of 4 to 6 meters, maybe higher in certain species. Some of them are on the slightly tender side, but nearly all the ones you can find for sale in the UK are hardy. Runners are things like Phyllostacis and Sasa bamboos. Sasa bamboos I wouldn't suggest you get for your garden, because they just can take over very quickly. Phyllostacis bamboos are good if you've got a root barrier down, so you can control it by putting a physical hard plastic barrier under the soil and slightly above the soil to stop it spreading. And they generally do behave like clumpers, Phyllostacis, for many years in most soils in the UK. Only after really warm summers and when they've got really established do they normally start sending out runners everywhere, but they will eventually spread because they are all runners. All Phyllostacis are runners. That's Phyllostacis nigra, Phyllostacis auriculis vivax, and other ones as well. So it might say clumping on the label, but if it's the Phyllostacis, it will eventually run unless you contain it somehow. This is an example of a running bamboo that's acting a bit like a grove in my front garden. So this is Phyllostachus vivax auriculis, and these are these amazing yellow, butter yellow culms, and do have to sort of clip the lower leaves off to get this open appearance, and you do that every year because the leaves will grow back up the culm or the stem of the plants, but you can just cut them away in spring and summer when they appear again. And these are amazing plants because they look good all year round. They look good in summer and winter, autumn and spring. And like I said, they're evergreen, so yes, leaves slowly fall off throughout the year, but they're replenished every year, and so they've always got some green foliage on them. This is another bamboo. This is Phyllostachus parvifolia, and parvifolia means small-leaved, and these are these nice green culms. And this has been in my garden for about 6-7 years now, and it's still an immature plant. In time, this particular species can get absolutely huge. If it was, 20-30 years old, been fed lots and had lots and lots of water and lots of warm summers, you could get the stems, or the culms as they're properly known as, can be like 10 or more centimeters wide, whereas the ones in the photograph here about 1 to 3 centimeters wide. So they can get to be absolutely mighty plants. So that's why you wouldn't plant this in a small garden or without some sort of containment, because they will shoot these massive culms eventually all over the place. And thinking about the Varieties again, you can use that as a hedge. So in this photograph at the top left, you've got my Fargesia hedge. On the right, you've got a conifer hedge. So the Fargesia hedge basically is 2 to 3 meters tall. This is Fargesia robusta, and like I said, loads and loads of culms are produced every spring. Gets to its maximum height in sort of like 1 or 2 months, and then there it is at its maximum height, and you know exactly how big it is, and then each spring it'll do the same sort of growth pattern, shoot for the sky, max out at 2 to 3 meters, and slowly spread out, which you can sort of obviously contain by having a barrier if you wish, or just cutting down the older culms, so it's kept in check that way. So Fargesias can be really good for a hedge or a background plant rather than just a specimen plant like the Phyllostachus are. So we can move on to palm trees now. So palm trees, I think, are the typical exotic plant for the garden. I think if anybody thinks about what can I grow in my garden that looks truly exotic, reminds you of holidays, I think a palm tree always comes to mind. So here we have a Chimerops in the background there, which is nice and hardy. And here we've got some nice snowy palm trees as well. So here it just shows you that palm trees can be truly hardy. Just checking my messages, make sure we can still hear me before I carry on. And it looks like yes, we've got sound still, and I'm still online. You can see there's a few questions coming in. I will answer some of these questions after I've gone through the presentation. So yeah, let's talk about palm trees now. And here we have the Trachycarpus buried in snow, and this wasn't affected whatsoever, apart from the odd bent leaf, which quickly bounced back once the snow melted. So this is Trachycarpus fortunei, the most commonly grown palm across temperate regions, I would say, especially UK. So it is hardy down to between -15 to 18-ish at a push, but you don't obviously see that in typical winters in the UK, apart from really exposed parts of central Scotland and central England in very bad winters. So you're not going to see this palm getting damaged in the UK. so it needs no protection whatsoever. And again, we're talking about evergreen plants tonight, and exotic evergreen plants, and Trachycarpus fortunei definitely fits the bill. And this is what it looks like in the summer. So in the left hand side it's hidden a bit, but it's in the background there with a Fargesia bamboo and a Mahonius soft caress at the bottom right of the left hand side picture. And we've got a bit of ginger growing as well on the bottom left corner, and just above that you might see we've got a Dicksonia antarctica tree fern as well. On the right hand side, again, this is another photograph of a Trachycarpus fortunei. This one is, well, it was taken I think in May, and it's flowering, so you can see those big bunches of yellow flowers. You get the male and you get the female forms of the Trachycarpus fortunei, and these flower, like I said, every year on mature plants. Doesn't take too long to get mature either. They can start flowering from sort of about 7-8 years old, something like that, from seed. And these you can grow from seed, and it doesn't take too long to get a decent sized plant. But obviously you can buy them as small plants, and sometimes you can pick these up as mature plants for very little money. You can see them on things like FreeCycle and eBay, where you can get them for free if you go around and dig them up before people chop them down because they're having an extension, or they've decided they don't want the plant. So you can pick up bargain Trachycarpus fortunei pretty much every year. I've seen many on the sales pages on local Facebook pages and things like that. And it gives you a bit of interest in spring and summer when you have these yellow unusual flowers as well. So we've shown it in the snow, we've shown it in the summer. This is the must-have exotic evergreen plant for your garden, because it is an amazing palm tree, often overlooked because it's quite commonly gardened now for exotic gardeners. But if you're just starting out and you want a backbone plant that looks good all year round, then Trachycarpus fortunei is a really good one to go for. And just be aware of the size of it, so don't plant it too close to a fence or too close to other plants, because it will, you know, spread. The trunk isn't too wide, but the canopy itself, you know, you're talking a good couple of meters or so at least, from leaf tip to leaf tip. But it's not just Trachycarpus fortunei that are hardy in most locations in the UK. We've got what Americans often call as jelly palms, because the fruit of these palm trees you can make a jelly from, and it's edible. It's quite nice to have as well. And these are the bootias. So I've listed 3 on this slide. So we've got Bootia odorata, Erispatha and Cateriensis. The first 2 I found to be very hardy. And when I say very hardy, I mean proven to -8 without any issues. Obviously, if you're in a garden, central England, or further north than where I live, then these are less hardy than the Trachycarpus fortunei, but they're hardy enough for most for inclusion in this talk, I believe. So odorata is the main one that you'll find. Big growing palm, pretty slow to get going, but once it gets going it has these wonderful arching leaves, and it really is a good statement palm for the garden. It takes a long time to get a big trunk going up in the sky, but for many years you'll have this beautiful plume of foliage. And the Erispatha looks pretty similar to odorata, but has normally a much greener leaf. So that's on the right hand side in this picture. So you might come across this one, and it's another great one to go for. Cateriensis is only hardy, I found reliably hardy, to about -5. Going lower it's a bit more dubious. People have had it down to -8 or so, but it can get damaged at that sort of temperature. And I've lost one at -7 before. So depending on the size of the palm, the hardiness changes as well. The bigger the plant, generally there's more chance it's going to be hardier. But if you're going to pick a jelly palm, go for odorata, because that is pretty much the hardiest and the easiest one to find as well. And here we have probably the second most common palm after Trachycarpus fortunii. These are the European fan palms, and there's three sort of types or varieties or species. Some sort of arguments about how many species of European fan palm there are, but there's definitely the one in the centre with humilis. This is the one again you'll find in garden centres across the country every summer. Normally it's very small plants and they're not normally too expensive, and unlike Trachycarpus fortunii, which you grow for a big hairy trunk and then the canopy of leaves above, Chimerops humilis is more of a shrub rather than a tree, or a small tree. It has many trunks, so it'll grow up in different directions with the foliage up the trunk and on the top of the trunk, and unless you take off a lot of that foliage it'll just look like a big sort of spiky bush really. And then we have Cerifera, which we have on the left hand side there, and that is the blue form or possibly separate species of European fan palm. This I found to be a bit hardier than humilis. It's a little bit harder to find, but it's well worth tracking down. And with this and humilis there is great variation. Some will be more vigorous than others. Some will hold their colour better. So in Cerifera the blueness is best on the freshest leaves, and some individuals will keep that waxy blue coating for much longer through the year than others that seem to have it washed away through our cold, wet winters. So look out for these and hopefully pick up one that's got really good coloration. Like I said, they are hardy down to about -10 or 12 in that sort of temperature range. Obviously small plants can be damaged at much lower temperatures, just -5, -6 when they're very small, but once they're in the ground and established they should take -10 in their stride. And volcano is similar again, but it has sort of wider leaflets and less spikes on the leaf stems or the petioles, and again it's a very slow growing palm. All these European fan palms are pretty slow growing, but it's a great one to have because it's hardy and it's evergreen. That's what we're looking at in tonight's presentation. And these do flower again like Trachycarpus fortunii, and they set seed quite well. Now if you want a really impressive palm in your garden and you're willing to either spend a lot of money or wait a long time, then the Chilean wine palm, Jubea chilensis, is the one to go for. It's classed as a feather palm, so the leaves are like feathers rather than the Trachycarpus fortunii where the leaves look like palms. So this has really long leaves and they can easily be well over 2 meters long, the leaves, and it gets an absolutely massive grey trunk over time, but at least I think it's at least sort of 40 years really before you get that big impressive trunk going skywards. For the first sort of 5 to 20, 30 years you'll see the trunk forming, but it won't start going skywards till it's about 40 years old, something like that. So you either buy big or you grow a lot of patience and watch them grow over a lifetime. But they are pretty hardy, so again some specimens have survived -15 and lower, but with some damage. Generally down to about -10 you shouldn't see too much damage on these. Mine's never been damaged, never been spear pulled, and it's gone through all the gales and it's not looked too tatty come spring. So this is an amazing palm to grow. Quite hard to find, it's getting harder to find, so you might have to really search these out now, but even if you can only find a small specimen it still looks interesting in the garden all year round. Right, moving away from palm trees now, and we've got ferns. So tree ferns, They are obviously exotic. They are hardy for most people most winters, and they can be evergreen in mild winters. So this winter right now, all my tree ferns are outside. They're still green. The leaves haven't been scorched by the cold. They've had snow on them on a couple of occasions. They've had -4, and the leaves still look as green pretty much as what you can see in these photographs. So this is one I've included because it is so exotic and it looks so amazing in the garden, and it's pretty readily available every year. It's definitely worth including as a backbone evergreen plant in your garden. When it gets to lower than -5, you might find that the leaves do scorch, blacken off. So strictly speaking, you might not class it as an evergreen if you live in a colder part of the UK. But for most winters now, as we're getting a bit more milder, and for a lot of the country, they do hang on to the green in the leaves most winters. Even when we had -7, some of the leaves stayed green. So it's still, definitely had structure all year round to the garden. And hardiness, again, you need to protect it when it gets to sort of below -5. I put straw in the centre of these as protection, and you can wrap them up with straw and fleece as well if you know you're going to get colder spells of your winter, or you forecast a really cold spell of weather. Getting down to -10, you get worried about these plants. I don't want any temperatures down to -10 or lower. They can survive if you protect them really well, but they might not come back if they get under -10. So it's borderline whether it's hard in many locations. But for this episode, for this presentation, I'm classing it as pretty hardy for most of the UK. I know if you're watching continental America, these aren't hardy at all. So like I said, Dixonia antarctica, this is the tree fern that you're going to find in most garden centres and the DIY sheds as well. You find this in B&Q pretty much every year, sometimes as very small plants with no trunk, or sometimes as just a trunk with no leaves in the spring, like we talked about last week. We talked a lot about Dixonia antarcticas. Or later on in the year, if it's been well watered, you'll see the leaves as well. Might be potted up, or it might just be a trunk with the leaves that you have to plant in the garden yourself and plant in the soil. But I mean, you can see from this photograph, this double header, it's just a very exotic looking plant of the garden. Obviously we're well through this presentation. Tonight's episode is really aimed at people that are just starting out or thinking about growing more evergreen exotic plants in the garden. So it's like your beginner's guide to evergreen exotics for the garden. So we move to a very different type of plant now. So we move into the arid plants. So these are evergreen. You might not really think about them too much as having lots of leaves, but obviously they are leaves. So we've got things like, on the left hand side we've got a yucca. We've got Yucca rostrata there. In the middle we've actually got another palm tree, but this one's a little bit different because it can cope with higher temperatures, and it can cope with drying out a little bit more, although the roots do go down into moisture, and that is Briar and Marta. And the right hand side you've got an agave, and agaves, again, they store their water in their leaves, so it can go a long time without being watered. And in fact, in my garden I very, very rarely water my arid bed where my agaves are. And these are all evergreen, and I think you can agree they're very exotic looking plants and look very unusual in the garden. And they're hardy. So Yucca rostrata -10ish, Briar Marta again -10, -12 at a push. Younger sizes maybe only -5 or so, but the one in the photograph has had -8, 9, 10 as well, and it's come back. And on the right hand side, agaves, depending which agave you grow and choose for your garden, can be very hardy. So this one is agave montana, and that's really hardy down to -10 and lower. Pardon me. And agave americana is the one you normally find in garden centres. That isn't hardy for everybody everywhere. -5 it's fine, getting lower it's borderline depending how big it is and how wet it is as well as cold. But generally speaking you can get some really hardy agaves now. So we just touched on agave in Montana. This was only really discovered about 25 years ago, grown in sort of pine forests, I believe, on the sort of the pretty much close to pine trees, in a sort of more of a not highland but higher ground, so it has cold winters and it's pretty dry as well. And this, like I said, it's seen my garden -7 many times, but I know in other people's gardens lower than -10, and it's come back. You might see it quoted in books and online as something like -15, -20, but in the UK I wouldn't suggest it's quite so hardy. Yuccas you find everywhere. You can find them in garden centres, you'll find them in exotic gardens, you'll find them in cottage gardens as well. They seem to be a plant because they're so hardy in many species that you'll just find them absolutely everywhere. Been grown in the UK for generations and generations, mainly Gloriosa and Fimentosa, but now we're getting a much wider range of yuccas, and some will form trunks and get quite tall over many years, whereas some stay pretty shrubby and have the rosettes at ground level and just have clumps of multiple rosettes. And the hardiness for most of the ones you'll find are at least -5, but many of them are -15, -20 in some species as well. So again, you'll find these as small plants in garden centres, but they grow much quicker than you might think, and they will bulk up pretty good and make a sizable plant within 5-10 years. So again, think about how big these can get. Yucca gloriosa and the ones that sort of Fimentosa, they can have lots of different heads of different rosettes, and they can make quite a sizable plant, several meters across. The ones that trunk, like Yucca rostrata that we saw in the previous slide, that one on the left hand side, that is the photograph there, is just the top of the plant. It's got like a good 1.5 meter trunk below that as well. So they can grow pretty tall over time, and they flower and they branch as well. So these are two of my favourite yuccas here. We've got linearis, or lineafolia as it's often called, and rostrata as well. Very similar looking plants, but rostrata has slightly wider leaves and linearis have got the thinner leaves, and I found linearis to be actually hardier and have less spotting or issues in spring in the UK climate compared to rostrata, which, if you've got a big strong growing plant, yes, -10, it should take it in its stride, but really wet winters and cold springs it might get spotted, it might suffer a little, whereas linearis seems to shrug off pretty much everything. Again, soils for these, you don't have to go mega gritty, but I like to grow them in really free draining soils. So I have them in pure grit with topsoil underneath, and if you can get them on a slope, all the better. South facing slopes the best, so you've got maximum sunlight and maximum heat for most of the time. Desilarions as well. This is another spiky plant with serrated leaves, as well as being sometimes spiky as well at the end, or little tufts at the end. Many of these are hardy. So you've got wheelii and glaucophyllum, which are hardy to about, again, -10, -15. But if you've got a run of really soggy winters, you might find it to be a bit less hardy. Most that you find will see -5 totally fine, and then it's sort of in the range of -5 to -10, where it should get through, but in some winters it might not. So this is a bit more of a gamble than some of the other plants I've talked about so far this evening. And then we move on to exotic shrubs. So we've got all sorts of things here. Some of these plants you might find in cottage style and regular gardens, but in the exotic setting they're really good background plants, and again they look good all year round. So the two centre plants you might recognise, you've got Fatsia japonica on the centre left, and you've got Akuba on the centre right. You can pick these up really cheap, less than £5 as small plants from garden centres, and they grow into good sized shrubs, maybe 1 to 3 metres tall and wide, something like that, with really nice glossy leaves, palmate glossy leaves in the Fatsia, and often spotty leaves with nice berries in the Cuba. The other two plants on this slide, on the far right, you've got another Fatsia. This is Fatsia polycarpa with more serrated leaves, indented leaves, and then on the far left you've got a plant from New Zealand called Pseudopanax, and this is Pseudopanax ferox, and crassifolius, which are hardy. I found hardy down to -7. Ferox is meant to be -5-ish, and crassifolius -10-ish. But I found both to be just as hardy as each other, and I've called that a shrub, but it does eventually grow into a tree. All these plants are hardy in most of the UK. They're definitely evergreen, and I think you'll agree look very exotic. So this is a close-up of the lancewood Pseudopanax crassifolius. Like I said, it should see -10 with no problems, and it has these weird leaves. They look dead. You either love it or hate it. It's one of those Marmite plants. So basically it grows like this so that in its native habitat, sort of grazing animals don't take much interest in it because they don't want to nibble something that looks dead, and it's quite serrated and rough on the edges. And eventually when it gets established and mature, it will grow more regular, softer leaves at the top to form a canopy. Fatsias, Japonicas, polycarpas. Like I said, Japonica you'll find in every garden centre across the country. Polycarpa is seen in more and more garden centres over the last 4 or 5 years, and this is a really nice plant. Nice deep green leaves, like I said, really nice sort of indented leaves, and looks really, really exotic. And Japonica, when it's completely frozen through, and Polycarpa when it's like sub-zero all day, it can sort of shrivel up, and you might think, oh, is it not hardy at all, is it dying? And it's basically dehydrating to preserve its leaves when it's completely frozen solid. Soon as temperatures get above freezing, it'll plump up and look totally fine. Japonica is easily -15, no issues whatsoever. Polycarpa should be about -12-ish, but I've not seen it at those temperatures myself. Like I said, I've seen it down to about between -8 and -9, something like that, and it's been totally fine. We mentioned the Cuba japonica, the Japanese laurel. You'll see this in many forms, different variegations, all the solid green leaves, and you have nice berries on this as well. And it will grow in places where a lot of plants won't grow, so it will grow in deep shade, in dry shade. It's really good for those sort of difficult spots in the garden. And you can put this, plant this in the garden, give it a good watering, and forget about it. And you can have the lush foliage plants and other striking annuals and things like that in front of it for the summer display. And then when they die down, you've always got this nice green background of these hardy evergreen plants. Another great one, probably not the best photograph to show it to its full potential and glory, is the loquat or Eritrea japonica. A lot of these plants, you notice, are called japonica because they hail from Japan or were cultivated a lot in Japan in the past when it was named. And this loquat will grow edible, delicious fruits if you get a really long, hot summer, which we don't get many of in the UK, but in the continental climates you will get fruit on a regular basis. In the UK, I think we had a good year last year, or the year before, for these fruiting, especially in London and the south, and they get really nice yellow fruits. But you can grow it just for the big, glossy leaves, especially if you grow it in shade. You get much bigger leaves than if you grow it in sun, and it will grow into a big tree eventually, but you can sort of treat it as a shrub and keep it sort of in check with its growth. And it's just a really unusual but great hardy exotic plant for the garden. And like I said, if you're lucky enough, you'll get flowers if it's in a sunnier location, and you'll get the fruits as well if you get a long hot summer and good pollination. So we move on to another plant that is hardy, again, so at least minus 10ish, and that's Euphorbia mellifera. Euphorbia, I think, is the biggest plant family in the world. It covers everything from proper spiky arid plants to temperate and truly exotic and tropical plants as well. This is from the Mediterranean, the Canaries as well. This is Euphorbia mellifera, so it smells like honey, and it grows to 3 meters tall and wide. It sets seeds really easily, so you can propagate this dead easy from seed and grow it into a big plant. Between 3 to 5 years, you'll have a good sized plant like in this photograph here, which is a specimen over 2 meters tall, and it flowers in spring, so you get early interest, but it's evergreen, so it looks good all year round. You'll have these interesting leaves, lots of leaves as well. You have to be careful about the sap on this plant, because it is a bit caustic, so you don't want to get any skin, especially if it's a sunny day. But it's a beautiful background plant that comes into its own, like I said, in spring when it flowers, so it's another great one to have in your garden. And if we think about true exotic trees or exotic looking trees, yes, we've mentioned palm trees. We've got the Brea Marta on the left and the false coconut in the middle, the mule palm. These will grow into big trees in, over a long period of time. But if you want a quick growing tree, you can't get any quicker than eucalyptus. So on the right hand side we've got a specimen of eucalyptus, and these grow phenomenally fast. So you don't want to grow it near a house, you don't want to grow it near buildings really, or near a fence or a wall, because it will get huge and it will send out massive thick roots that as big as the tree trunks almost, the thickness of the roots, and they can be just under the surface. So you don't want to plant that close to somebody else's garden or close to a patio, because it will suck all the moisture out of the ground, and it will also be 3D. It will bump up, you'll see the roots above the ground as well as below the ground when it gets established. But if you've got the space, then it's an amazing quick growing tree for the garden, and will make a beautiful canopy, quite a dappled shade underneath in most cases, if you can find plants to grow under it. So I've got a few in my garden that I planted right at the bottom of the garden, so they are 50 meters away from my house, furthest point away in my garden, and they are growing really quick. We're talking, when they're at the fastest, they can grow meters a year, several meters a year, so they can grow huge quickly. I grew some of mine from seed, or from very small saplings, and they are now, I can't really measure them, but they're like double the height of my house, so many meters tall, and that's only in 9 years. So they do grow huge. You can get smaller growing types, but they're still going to get pretty big overall. But the foliage is really nice. It's evergreen, unlike most of the native deciduous plants. We can have deciduous trees in the UK, and you've got colourful bark. So you have whites, fawns, goldens, greens, reds, pretty much all the colours under the sun for their barks. So they are great trees if you've got the space. And we're going to come to a couple of honourable mentions. So the photograph here is definitely not really an evergreen plant, but you probably guessed what it is. It's Tetrapanax papyrifera rex, or just Tetrapanax papyrifera, and these grow as big, like big trees eventually, and they have huge leaves, and they are stunning. They look exotic, they are hardy, down to -10 at least for most individual plants. I know some people have suffered at -6, 7 or 8 with losing plants, but they can go down to -15 or lower and regenerate from the ground as well. I've just included them, just if you've never seen a Tetrapanax before. These are very hardy, like I just mentioned, and they look truly amazing. One of the most exotic, unusual plants you can grow in your garden. But they come with a couple of warnings. They are huge, so you need a lot of space for them, and they can sucker quite badly if you disturb the roots. They might pop up in your lawn or next door. So again, be careful where you choose to plant these. They can be easily tamed by cutting the suckers and the shoots when they come, but it can be an ongoing task to do so. But I'm just including it in this talk just to show you a huge exotic looking plant that is hardy, and in mild winters it does hang on to one or two central leaves, so you could maybe class it as an evergreen. And this is a hardy exotic plant, but definitely herbaceous. Just thought I'd show you this one. This is Colocasia pink china, which we'll talk about more in upcoming episodes, but it's a beautiful hardy Colocasia with really unusual leaves, but it will die back, lose its leaves in winter. And obviously Musa baju, the hardy banana plant that you grow in the UK. Again, this is evergreen in its native habitat quite often, and it's definitely exotic looking. Probably along with palm trees, bananas are the typical exotic looking plants. And like I said, it's hardy for most of the UK, but it's not evergreen for most of the UK because the frost will kill off its leaves. And there we are, another type of Colocasia. This is mammoth. Fantastic leaves on these, and these can be hardy with a good mulch in some of the UK. I'm just mentioning these last few plants just because they are so exotic looking, and some people might class them as hardy in the UK. And finally, the biggest growing leafed plant I think you can grow in the UK, and that is Gunnera manicata. Absolute huge leaves. The stems of each leaf can be easily 2 meters tall. The leaves can be many meters across individual leaves. Absolutely monster plants that need lots of space, ideally lots of water, very hardy, but they are herbaceous. But I'm just showing you because it is an amazing plant. And that is the end of the talk. I've gone through that at a quick pace, but hopefully you got most of what I said in that. You can obviously go back after this and rewind it. And I'll open the floor to some questions, and let's see what questions we've had while I've been doing the talk. So let's just go to the chat and have a look at some of the questions. Hopefully you've enjoyed the talk tonight. Obviously you can leave it at this point if you don't want to hear any question and answers, and I'll join you next week. But if anybody wants to stay on, we can have a look at some of the questions and I'll give you my opinions and answers on them. So let's have a look at the chat. Just waiting for it to come on my screen. Hopefully some questions tonight. Okay, there's quite a few come through. First few about no sound. Hopefully with the sound problem got sorted out. Yeah, it's been bad weather, hasn't it? You know, it's not been the best weather for going out and doing gardening this weekend. Especially if you're in my part of the country, it's been so wet. I mean, today has been non-stop rain all day. It's been really foul out there. But I've been doing things. I have been in the greenhouse. I've been sowing seeds. I've been sowing solanum seeds and cleome seeds to get decent sized plants for planting out later in the year. So there are things to be doing, but I'd stick to the indoor jobs at the moment. So we've got a few comments here. Let's have a look. So James Clayton talks about honey spurge looking good in his garden. So that's my Euphorbia mellifera that we looked at earlier. Again, as long as it's not a really bad winter, that will look good all year round. Holds on to its leaves well and has beautiful scented flowers, if you like honey that is, in spring. Lindsay Kane Wale has bamboos in big pots. That's another way you can grow bamboos. We talked about we talked about clumpers and runners earlier, and we talked about having a barrier in the soil, but you can grow them in big pots. I would stick to the smaller growing types if you're going to put them in pots, sort of the Fargesias again. The Philostachys you can grow in pots, but over time you find you're going to have to water them a lot, especially in summer. You're going to have to feed them a lot to keep them looking good, and the roots are so strong that they can very often burst out of the pots, and if you're not careful they can find the drainage holes, send out some shoots and roots and get into the ground that way and travel even over tarmac or paved areas find some soil and get in that way. So you still keep a look at those pots if you're growing it in pots, and making sure that it's contained within that pot, and keep it really well watered and fed if you want it to look good for a long period of time. Let's have a look. What else have we got? Yeah, some people love the Cuba japonica. Yeah, it's a great underrated plant for the garden. Always really hardy wherever you are in the UK, and always looks pretty good. And like I said, can really deal with those dry, shady spots. Let's see what else we got going on. Did I miss anything at the beginning of the live stream? Yeah, you missed me talking to myself because I didn't put the sound on. But that got sorted after about 3 or 4 minutes. If you watch the first 3 or 4 minutes and catch up, you'll just see me miming basically. So miss out the first few minutes. Peter Armstrong asked about Fatsia spider's web and how large they can grow. Well, Fatsia spider's web is a form of Fatsia japonica which has got real heavy variegation. So it's speckledy, splodgy whites and creams and green. And because it's got such heavy variegation, it stops it growing as big as the straight green-leaved version of the plant. So it doesn't get that big. I mean, a metre is normal, 2 meters is absolutely pushing it. I've had one in the ground for many years now, and it's probably only about 1 meter tall. It's not that big a plant at all because of the variegation. It doesn't have that vigor, like I said, like the green form of japonica, so it does keep it quite small. So you can incorporate that into an area in your garden where you want a plant that won't get too big and unruly. Generally, variegated plants are less vigorous than the green forms. Did I mention cordylines? I didn't talk about cordylines this week. Cordylines talked about last week. They are pretty hardy, the green australis forms, and again they get to be really great fountains of leaves and nice foliage, and they get to be quite tall. So I should have talked about cordylines really for this video. But for whatever reason I've missed it off the top. But yeah, a great hardy exotic evergreen plant. If you buy or attempt to buy the coloured leaves, so the pink ones especially, they are far less hardy. So you'll find that these might come through some winters, or they might not come through some winters depending where you live. Let's see what else we got. So we've got Brachypelma smithii, and they ask about putting straw in the heart of the fern. Can I remove this? So I'm guessing you're putting straw in a tree fern. I'm guessing it's Dicksonia antarctica. Can you remove this? I wouldn't remove it yet. We're still in February. And we get our most snow in February and March, so I wouldn't remove it yet. I would think about just checking that it's not completely bone dry in the centre. I think if you live in the UK, you'll have had plenty of rain recently and it won't be bone dry. So definitely check on the centres, and make sure the straw's still there, because obviously with all the winds and stuff it might have blown away. If you've got fleece on, definitely see if any moisture's got through and it's not too dry. But I'll leave it there. You've still got a while before you're going to see new foliage grow on a tree fern. It's April at the earliest, and into May and possibly even June before you get that flush of leaves. So you've still got plenty of time to leave the protection on there without it deforming and squashing the newly emerging leaves. So I'd keep it there at least till mid-March. You might want to take it out in mid-March. You might want to replace it if it's rotten, if you've had it for months, if you had straw in the centre. But generally, you can leave it there till mid-March, and maybe even to April, depending what the weather's like. Thanks for the super chat, Frank Mendoza. Thanks for watching. Let's see if we've got anything else. Alan the Cat asked about Melianthus major. Yeah, that's another exotic plant that looks truly amazing in the garden with its sort of glaucous leaves, and it is pretty much evergreen as well. It can act as herbaceous in cold winters. There are many plants I could have talked about in the sort of talk tonight. I was doing basically an overview of the truly spectacular ones and the very easy to grow ones and the most commonly available exotic hardy evergreen plants, but there's so many other plants. I'm just sort of picking out some of the highlights in the talk tonight, but yeah, we could talk about thousands and thousands of other plants as well. Melianthus major, by the way, you can grow from seed and pick out the sort of bluest individuals, or you can buy it as a plant. In cold winters it gets cut down to the ground, so under -5 it'll probably get cut down to the ground and then regrow basically as a herbaceous shrub the following year. And in years where it's not too cold, so mild winters, it'll keep its foliage and its stems from previous summers and get to be quite a lanky plant basically, but it has really good foliage. I've not got a photograph to show you at the moment, but if you look up Melianthus major, then you'll see the glaucous serrated foliage. I'll just refresh the chat on my phone, make sure I've not missed anything. We are coming up to the hour as well, so we'll just do a couple more questions. We've tried to keep these live streams down to an hour. The Aroch is asking about pseudopanics for a wind barrier. The pseudopanics I've shown in this video are definitely not suitable for wind barrier because they're extremely flexible, and I'm not certain how much they can tolerate from rocking, to be honest. I've got mine, they have been rocking and rolling through the wind this week. They're normally growing quite free draining soils as well, but I'm not certain how great a windbreak they would make because they are very tall and skinny plants. You need loads and loads of them to make a decent windbreak. So I'd go for something else, to be honest, for a windbreak. I think I have one final question before we call it a night. This is interesting. This is definitely well worth discussing further. From Colin Fielder. He's got a Phyllostatus nigra in full flower. He asks, what are the chances it will recover? And do I grow this bamboo? Yes, I grow Phyllostatus nigra. I think most people that grow Phyllostatus will probably have come across Phyllostatus nigra, the black-stemmed bamboo. Very hardy, very easy to find. Normally clumps, like I said, it is a runner, so it will eventually run if you give it time and space. I've not seen this one flowering. I've had other bamboos flower. I've had what did we have flowering? We had a Phyllostatus flower a few years ago, and it recovered. I cut all the flowering stems off, sent off more flowering stems, cut them off, and then eventually in the second and third year it's gone back to normal foliage, so some can recover. But then we did have another bamboo flower, and it set seed everywhere in the garden, but the mother plant has died because it uses so much energy into producing its flowers. And it normally, if one plant flowers of a certain species, it'll flower all across the world pretty much within the next year or so. So it has this unique, a very unusual ability to synchronize its flowering across large areas and globally in many cases as well. So if you've got Phyllostatus nigra flowering now, the chances are many of us will find this coming year we'll have our Phyllostatus flowering as well. And because they flower so irregularly, so it could be, I don't know what the flowering the difference between the last flowering period and this flowering period. It could be 40 years, it could be 100 years. I'm not certain for Phyllostatus nigra. It might be unknown to have flowered in a generation or two, so it might be that the seedlings of this generation will not flower again for many years. Some Fargesias do flower quite more often, so they'll sort of 15-20 years and then they'll just reproduce that way. But Phyllostachys normally takes a long time between generations to flower. So watch out if you're growing Phyllostachys nigra, especially if you want to get rid of it. This might be a good time to celebrate, because if the flower, the chances are it will use so much energy it will die out. So you might find yours flowering, so that's something to watch out for in 2022, maybe going over to 2023 as well. But they might recover. Again, I don't have experience of this one flowering, so we'll see how it gets on. So I think that's the end of this week's edition of the live stream of Exotic Gardening Live. Hope you've enjoyed it. Sorry about the sound issues at the beginning. And if you've got more questions and comments, you can do that once this is on YouTube in the normal comments way. So thank you for watching, and join me next week.